Our next panel is on ethics and regulations. Who's at the wheel or not? And our moderator today is Arent Jacoby, who's the managing partner of Arent Fox here in Los Angeles. He's also head of the firm's automotive practice nationwide. Arent.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear us? Good. You know, it's interesting to be in this room because one of the things I always promise is if everybody listens through to the very end and asks good questions, everybody gets a Ferrari. And here we actually have them. And I'm not kidding, that is something I usually tell people. So I'm joined here today by Dr. Bernard Soriano. Unfortunately, Director Shiamoto couldn't make it today. She was called away by an emergency. But Mr. Soriano is in charge of the DMV's autonomous vehicle program, the testing, the consideration of policy issues, etc. And so we have the right man for the job to let us know what's going on in the state of California. Dr. Soriano has an extensive engineering and science background. He has a PhD in engineering from UC Irvine, a master's in mechanical engineering from USC, and in my mind, one of the things that his background tells us is not only is he extremely well educated, but I'm very happy that we have someone with this sort of background in charge of the autonomous vehicle program in California because it helps us lead the way. So, welcome.
You're way too kind, Arent. Thank you for the introduction.
No problem. So we're here today to talk about autonomous transportation, and obviously within the regulatory structure and from a regulatory perspective. There are a lot of things that are going to be changing as time goes on. I know if many of you have been here all day, you've been listening to anticipation of the future. What will things be like? How disruptive is everything? But on the ground, the Department of Motor Vehicles and the state of California are regulating these areas. And Mr. Soriano, Dr. Soriano, you're in charge of that. So if you could tell us, I assume that a primary focus in this area is safety. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'll talk about the regulations in a minute and about how we came about developing those regulations or the rules to allow autonomous vehicles on our roadways. But as you said, the main focus is on safety. You know, the industry itself is developing autonomous vehicles for a lot of reasons, but first and foremost because of safety. Most of you already know the statistics. I mean, upwards of 40,000 people die on the United States roadways every year, and a large majority of that are because of human error or a human choice. And so if you can automate the driving function and minimize the human interaction during driving, you can somehow reduce that number. Now, no one's saying it's going to go to zero, but we can certainly reduce the number of people that die on our roadways, and the autonomous technologies are going to help with that. So that's been our focus because we want to ensure that this life-saving technology comes forth. We want to help the technology flourish, but we want to do it in a way that still keeps the motoring public safe. So it's been challenging, and it's one that we're having a lot of fun working on it because it's new technology and it's something that's going to change society, and you don't get a chance to do that very often in your career.
And one of the things I know is part of the regulatory process currently is tracking the data concerning safety and other issues that occur in the autonomous vehicles, right?
That's right. You know, and again, I'll talk about the data that's being submitted to us by these companies that are testing autonomous technologies. But that's a big piece, is understanding how the technology is being developed, how it progresses, so that we can make decisions on whether or not the technology is actually ready for you and I to use it. And that's all part of the scheme of rolling out this technology in a very thoughtful, methodical, safe way.
And without getting into the specifics of particular vehicles, a particular vehicle that might be on the road, does the testing data seem to be confirming the thesis you just brought out that safety will become increasingly more possible?
Well, it's a little too early to come to some conclusion about that, because we have millions of cars on our roadways now. They're driving millions of miles on our roadways, and you compare the overall population of the vehicles to the autonomous vehicles that are currently just being tested on our roadways, and they're two different things. And so it's really hard at this point to come to a conclusion, but the point is we're gathering data now to help us get to that conclusion.
And I hope as we get closer to an acceptable safety standard, I assume that what you're also trying to focus on is opening up transportation and mobility to perhaps the underserved in the community.
That's right. I talk about safety and safety being our focus, but we also understand that there's a lot of benefits to autonomous technologies over and above the safety aspect. I'm talking about the underserved communities or the disabled community, seniors that, our department takes away the license from people that no longer have the ability to drive safely. And so those people all of a sudden have lost their mobility. With autonomous technologies now, the whole segment of our population can suddenly become mobile, and the quality of their life becomes much more enriched. And that's something that we recognize. We also recognize a number of different business models that may be coming forth with autonomous technologies, that we need to ensure that those business models are ready and that they would benefit us as a society.
When you were talking about the underserved, and in particular, I suppose the disabled community might be well served by these vehicles. One of the first things that I saw with regard to autonomous vehicles was a film produced by Google. Mm-hmm. I guess we're not supposed to shout out names of anybody here, but that's who happened to produce the movie, and it was about the very first autonomous vehicle to roll off the assembly line and be delivered to an ultimate consumer who was ready to drive it, and the gentleman was blind and drove the car to a takeout restaurant and ordered a burger and drove home, and it really brought a tear to my eye, I have to admit. But I think that's the sort of thing you're talking about.
That's right. It's bringing mobility, improving the quality of life for the people that that currently cannot get around for whatever reason, being a disability or the inability to drive. That's what it's about.
Well, when you mentioned serving various communities, you also talked about industrial changes, and you said quickly something about a business model. Are the regulations currently, or are they anticipated to actually regulate the business model?
Well, we're crafting regulations to allow for different business models to flourish. And so we're trying to be mindful of how companies are developing the technology and how they plan on rolling out the technology so that regulations would fit and it would be copacetic. We also need to ensure that the various regulatory agencies need to be aware of how companies are developing the technologies so that those technologies and business models can roll out in a way that comports to whatever regulations are in place. So it's one where the more we know, the more we're aware of, we're able to gather that input and really help formulate those rules.
So the focus would be on the technology and the safety resulting from that technology, not on the actual business model.
That's right. That's exactly right. Because really, industry's best poised to determine what's the best way to utilize the technology. We just need to make sure that it's being done in a safe manner.
The regulations, I'm not sure if everybody in the room has an idea of the breadth or scope of the regulations or has actually read through them. It might be a good opportunity for you to...
It's good bedtime reading.
Yeah. Other than bedtime reading, is there a way that you can take us through perhaps the story of how they came about, where we are now, and where we think those regulations are going?
Sure, absolutely. So we started working on this back in 2013. Governor Brown signed a piece of legislation that called for the Department of Motor Vehicles to develop regulations to allow autonomous vehicles on the public roadways within California. And that was signed in 2012, became effective in 2013, and the onus was put on the DMV to develop those regulations. We do regulations a lot, but this was for the first time the DMV was put in a position to do regulations around vehicles. Traditionally, it's been the federal government that has regulated vehicles, right? The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is the one that has the federal motor vehicle safety standards that every vehicle that's sold in the United States needs to meet at the time of sale. So we had a challenge because we needed to develop these regulations in an area where we needed to come up to speed very quickly on. So we partnered with a number of different agencies, our sister agencies, law enforcement, Department of Insurance, Caltrans, Office of Traffic Safety, but more importantly, the federal government, because we felt that it was very important to have NHTSA at the table as we developed these regs. So we went to work, and we decided to have this be a very open and transparent process. And what I mean by that is by having public workshops, public hearings, so that we could gather information from the industry, from advocacy groups, from the general public, and then use that information to develop regulations that would work. So we finished those testing regulations in 2014. September 2014 is when the California Autonomous Vehicle Testing Regulations took effect. And those regulations, they were the first step to allow these vehicles on our roadways, and they required a number of things. One was companies needed to demonstrate an ability to respond to a judgment of $5 million. So they needed to have a bond, insurance policy, or be self-insured, basically be able to demonstrate their ability to respond to that judgment. Secondly, we required that testing be done with a safety driver. We felt it was very important, at least in this stage, that a safety driver be present in the vehicle that is fully trained and ready to take over should the need arise. So we had that as a requirement. We also had requirements on what companies needed to do during testing. They needed to report any crash that has happened, and they also needed to report to us on an annual basis when the technology fails. We called them disengagements. So whenever the technology disengaged, companies needed to keep an accounting of that and give us a report at the end of every year. So as we sit here today, there are 52 companies that are approved for testing autonomous vehicles in California. Most of them, well, you'll see, if you take a look at those 52 companies, it's a mixture of OEMs, Tier 1 suppliers, technology companies like Google or Waymo being the most famous. Also conglomerates, Samsung and Qualcomm, but also a lot of startup companies in Silicon Valley. Small companies that are developing some components of autonomous technologies that will go into a vehicle in some form or fashion. So 52 companies, they're testing, mostly in Northern California, and they all reported their crashes to us. So since September, it's, last I looked, it's been 65 crashes, I believe, that have occurred. And all of this is on our website in case you're interested.
By the way, just to interject there,
65 crashes.
65 crashes out of how many test miles do you do?
Well, that's an interesting point because, well, I'll get to that.
Sure.
So let me talk about those crashes in a second because those crashes, by and large, have been very, very minor. I mean, the typical scenario has been an autonomous vehicle coming up on an intersection and the light's yellow. So the autonomous vehicle slows down, getting ready to come to a complete stop, like you and I do every day.
Like we're supposed to do.
Exactly.
And it stops too quickly?
And it stops because the light turns red, or it comes to an intersection and the light's red, it needs to make a right-hand turn, comes to a complete stop, like we all do, and then make a right-hand turn. Well, in the process of that occurring, a conventionally driven vehicle from behind comes up and hits the autonomous vehicle at low speed, somewhere about 1 to 5 miles an hour. And that's typically what we've seen. Now, there have been some more high-profile crashes that have happened, but by and large, it's been these minor, very, very minor fender benders.
So that would be in line with what you were saying earlier about increasing safety, and the test results would seem to confirm that, at least so far.
Sort of. It also points to this issue of public perception and public education. Yes. Right? Because we as society need to be aware and knowledgeable of how autonomous vehicles are operating on our roadways.
Right. If you're not willing to get into an autonomous vehicle at the airport and be driven home with nobody else in the car, I guess we're not ready for it.
Well, we aren't ready for the way cars are behaving, because we get upset when someone follows the rules of the road. Right? If someone's going 55 on the freeway, we all get upset about it. And so that's...
Wait. So you from the DMV also get upset about it?
Well, I follow the rules of the road. and so that's the point, is that it's highlighting the fact that there's got to be a public education aspect to the rolling out of the technology, because we're not used to vehicles following the rules of the road.
Right.
It also points to, we're talking about whether or not we can draw conclusions from those statistics. We know how many miles are driven by these autonomous vehicles during testing, because we get those reports. We know those crashes, 65. But we can't compare those crashes per mile, because every fender bender that occurs on our roadways now doesn't get reported to us. Police aren't called for every crash. So we can't really do an apples-to-apples comparison.
You can only compare within the data you're receiving, and I suppose there may be insurance data with regard to crashes nationwide.
Right, and so there are ways to get those or come to those conclusions, but we're still way too early in the game. So those testing regulations required the driver, and they were in effect since, like I said, September 2014.
And now we're without a driver.
And now, as of April 1st of this year, new regulations took effect where we are now allowing companies to test and deploy vehicles that do not require a safety driver in them. Deploy being a company could sell the vehicle or deploy it in whatever business model they have. If they want to do a fleet of vehicles in a ride-share environment, they can do that. Of course, there are a number of rules that they need to follow in order to be allowed to do it.
And are we ready to have them actually charge money for those services?
Well, so during deployment, they can. During testing, they can't. And so we deliberately put that provision in there to segment when companies are testing the technology versus deploying the technology.
And how does a company go from testing to deploying?
So there's an application process. Companies need to apply to us to get a testing permit, like those 52 companies have done. If any of those companies want to apply to us to test a completely driverless vehicle, they can do so, and they got to meet certain requirements. And then if they want to sell the vehicle, if they want to deploy the vehicle, they do the same thing. There's a application that they need to fill out and complete, meet all of these different requirements. We evaluate them, and then we'll render a decision.
And when we talk about deploying and selling, are we talking about selling for the purpose of ride sharing or taxiing, or are we talking about I can actually buy one from one of these companies?
We're talking about both, actually. So the process is in place for companies to do both of those. So if a company feels like they are ready to sell an autonomous vehicle, they can do so, if they apply to us and meet all of the requirements, and we evaluate them, and we find that they will be approved to do that.
And you mentioned that there were 52 companies, I think, that have applied for testing. Has anyone applied for deploying and selling?
No one has applied to us for deployment yet. And again, the regs have been in effect for just about a month. But we have had 2 companies apply to us to test completely driverless autonomous vehicles. I should also add, our regulations only cover passenger vehicles. So they don't cover vehicles that are over 10,000 pounds or commercial vehicles. And that was done for a number of reasons. One was, remember I said we want to foster this technology, we want to help the technology grow. It was felt that if the public saw for the first time autonomous technologies in a fully laden 80,000 pound semi-truck without anyone in it, that may not be the best way to introduce the technology to the general public.
Although there are trucking companies that are experimenting with autonomous trucks, autonomous delivery, et cetera. What is the DMV doing in that regard?
So all of those trucking companies that have implemented technologies are at a SAE level 2. None of them are at a level 3 in California. So the platooning, the other technologies that you see are level 2 technologies, which are allowed on our roadways. Our regs only cover a level 3 and above. And then as far as what the next step is for our regulations, that's something that we are looking at, is the commercial realm. And also that in itself will require a lot of different entities that we need to work with at the federal government as well as at the state level, because agencies such as the Highway Patrol or the Federal Carrier Safety Administration, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration needs to be involved.
One of the things that I find as a lawyer working in the industry among many states is that we find a patchwork of regulations, and they might each make sense, and they're internally logical, but when you're trying to have a business model work both in California and Florida and New York, et cetera, it can be very difficult to have a consistent model, a consistent means of testing, deployment, selling. And we find that that is a very frustrating process. Are the states actually working together to avoid some of that frustration for those?
That's a great question, because we get that all the time. And the short answer is yes. States are working together to try and prevent that. NHTSA, to their credit, has recognized that there is, without federal action, there is a possibility of a patchwork of regulations across the country. And NHTSA has funded a industry work group, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. They funded a work group within AMVA, and that work group is made up of 16 different states and 2 Canadian provinces. California is the chair of that work group. Michigan's the vice chair. And the purpose of the work group is to develop these guidelines for states to utilize should they choose to administer autonomous vehicles. And it's one where we really had to wrestle with the philosophical differences between states. Some states are heavily regulated, other states are not so regulated.
You mean California?
Not naming names.
Regulated.
And so we had to really recognize the way that different states operate. And so we've developed that set of guidelines. It's being published this month. And we have worked very diligently to try and encompass just the bare minimum of things that states should consider. And that'll go a long way to help minimize a patchwork, but still recognize the different states and their ability to put in place rules that are specific to their area.
Is there a publication date yet for the guidelines?
We finished writing it already, and it's gone through all of the vetting process, and it's been approved. Right now, it's all of the artwork that's being developed. So we thought it would be released this week. It looks like it's going to be about the mid part of May before it's ready.
And are there proposed best-in-class regulations within the guidelines?
Well, I like to think that what we did in California is something that is something that works, and that what we did in California is something that it took a lot because we had all of these different ideas, and because it was a public process, we felt that we got input that, candidly, some of those ideas, they said, you're crazy to try and implement that. So we said, you know what, you're right, we're not going to do that. And so we got to a point where the regs really work for industry, and they provide some window, however small, some window that the public can use to see how this technology evolves. And that'll help with the public acceptance.
And do you see any sign of the federal government actually getting anything off the ground for more uniform national regulations?
Well, there's, we work closely with them, and there's a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes that it doesn't necessarily make it into the press, but there's at the federal level a lot of it is very much data driven. Every single one of those federal motor vehicle safety standards is because there's a lot of data that supports it, and with autonomous technologies, it's so new. There's not a lot of data that you can base a standard on. And so they're in a tough position to, but nonetheless, it's something that they recognize and something that they want to, they're in the same boat as us. We want to help this technology move forward, but we want to do it in a way that keeps the motoring public safe.
As we're talking about statistics, I'm thinking of rating the risk that's involved once companies do apply to deploy, once they apply to sell, and once people are actually being driven around in these cars. Have any insurance companies come up with guidelines or risk-based assessments of this process?
We've met with a number of different insurance companies, and because they're very concerned about the technology and how the industry may change. And right now, it's an open question. For us, the way we addressed insurance in our regs is simply the requirement to respond to that judgment of $5 million. Over and above that...
That won't cover if somebody hits that car.
That's right. That's quite a car. That's a very nice car. But you're right. And that requirement is something that's in our statute, and so that's what we have in the regs. There are also some other things in our statute, such as recording sensor data for 30 seconds prior to a crash, and other items. But by and large, back to your question about insurance, that's an ever-evolving field.
The black box concept is very intriguing to me. It seems like it would be something that would be very helpful within the insurance context. And I imagine that will be something that must be kept as the deployment and sales element goes forward.
I mean, some of our vehicles now on our roadways do have event data recorders, most of them all, and so this is just another set that would be collected. It's meant to make a better determination about how the technology worked, what happened in a crash. So that data should be made available to law enforcement should law enforcement need that data.
With regard to the technology itself, what is the DMV and perhaps the regulations themselves, what is the role played with regard to enabling the technology?
Yeah, it's a good question. We spoke about safety at the beginning of this, and there are a lot of advocates that are really saying, look, the sooner this technology rolls out, the better it will be for me. It'll be better for us as a society. So we recognize that, and we're very sensitive to that fact. Like I said, we're sensitive to the plight of the folks that are disabled, to the seniors. And so it's in our best interest to try and roll this out in a way that will really benefit people. But at the same time, we have an obligation to ensure that it's being rolled out safely.
And are there proving grounds, infrastructure, or those sorts of things part of the state infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's, we talked about this enabling the technology and rolling out safely. One of the ways that we're doing it within the state is there are 2 officially designated autonomous vehicle proving grounds in California. One in Northern California in Contra Costa County and one in San Diego. And in Contra Costa County, they're moving forward with a pilot program where they have these autonomous shuttles that are able to move people around, and they've been testing it, and they're about ready to deploy it in a business park. And that business park houses a number of different companies, and employees come to the business park using public transportation, and they get dropped off in a hub, and then they have to get to their various companies. Well, this autonomous shuttle is going to be traversing the business park, picking up people from that hub and delivering them to their offices. So it'll, as that pilot program rolls out, we'll get a lot of data about the adoption, data about how the public feels about the technology, about the performance of the technology, and then also a peek into whether or not it's an effective way of moving people. So there are different things that are happening throughout the state that really help with the rollout of the technology.
That's very interesting. You know, I think we should probably see if the audience has any questions for you.
I'd be happy to
probably ask
at least try to answer some of the questions.
Sir, over there by the pillar.
So, thank you. I had 2 questions. Number 1, do the regulations for the data recorder, is that automatic, or is that just to law enforcement only, or do other people have access to that?
The regulations called for sensor data to be collected 30 seconds prior to a crash, and that the data be stored in a way that is easily retrievable in a read-only format. So law enforcement right now can get data from your car if it has an EDR, as long as they have a warrant or some other legal process to retrieve that data. And that remains the same moving forward.
So the owner of the vehicle owns the data, in essence, unless they get that warrant.
Right. We don't speak to the ownership of that data, but the way that law enforcement gets the data now is they need to have that warrant.
Great.
You know,
Last question.
cybersecurity and privacy are completely different areas of law and would be addressed separately within that legal context.
Understood. The second question was the $5 million judgment, I guess the information, does that apply, did that make it into the regulation for deployed vehicle as well?
Oh, yeah. And
Sir.
First, I just wanted to point out that whether or not autonomous vehicles are safer, we won't know until they're driven without people in them, because it's very possible that today somebody could have steered a vehicle that would otherwise have hit somebody seriously, and you don't know that.
Right.
But I also wanted to ask you, is anybody at the DMV or another agency in California dealing with a lot of the potential societal changes that are going to happen? For example, if we don't need to park because our cars will be able to park 5 miles away, what happens to the increased congestion in what otherwise would have been a very placid, quiet neighborhood? The way now Waze directs people onto side streets, and the neighbors get very annoyed. Or the major decline in parking meter revenues as people park their cars or never park their cars. Or more importantly, if it's proven that autonomous vehicles never hit anybody, we may then start seeing lots of pedestrians willy-nilly running across the street knowing they're never going to get hit. We'll have to rewrite traffic regulations, I presume. Is anybody looking at these issues now?
Boy, yeah, you threw a lot into that question, but you're absolutely right. There's all of those issues that you brought up and more are being discussed by a number of different entities at the state level as well as at the local level. There's a lot of discussion about how the technology is going to roll out and at what pace, and what type of changes are we going to see first. And then also what is needed to help with the rollout, what kind of infrastructure changes need to happen. The parking scenario. Right now, as developers build a building, they need to have X number of parking spots for X number of tenants. Should that ratio change? Should policies change with regard to where vehicles could traverse? Land use issues. We're having a lot of those discussions, and a lot of it is looking into that crystal ball. But when you look into a crystal ball, no one can definitively say X, Y, and Z is going to happen in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years.
And
so it's a tough one.
And I imagine a lot of the policy issues are being decided by the legislature or the governor's office and not by the DMV. Is that
right? Well, there's two aspects to that. You're right, but also there's some practicality issues that need to be dealt with. Like, for example, at the DMV, are we going to see a decline in driver licenses in the future? What about the registration of vehicles? All of those kinds of things. Do we keep building field offices, or are we going to a cashless society? So do we need to have these machines that process checks? All of those, talking about strategic planning, it's needed, and it's something that needs to be done, and we're doing it.
Going to the back of the room, there was a man there with your hand up. Yes, sir, go ahead.
As Dr. Soriano, I was wondering if you and your colleagues at the DMV, as well as your colleagues in other state governments, are you under pressure from legislators who have been bought off by high-tech companies and car companies to use regulatory power to impose autonomous vehicles on the rest of us and kick those of us off the road who like to drive our own cars?
Well,
that's a bit speculative, but if you have information on that, I'm not sure you can read the minds of the legislators.
We haven't been. Yeah, you're right. I can't speak for any of the legislatures. Our job is to implement what is in law, and what's in law is to develop the regulations to allow autonomous vehicles.
Yes, sir. In the purple shirt.
Yes. Do you think driverless will be like first available on highway where you have to drive in the city, but once you get on the highway you could be hands off, or do you think it's going to be at the same time?
Boy, driving on the freeway is much different than driving in a congested urban environment. It's a much easier problem to solve on the freeway than it is in the urban environment. That being said, there's different strategies that companies are moving towards on achieving completely driverless vehicles. Some companies are saying, look, we're always going to have somebody in that vehicle, because it's kind of what you were saying. People still love to drive. I love to drive. I love to own my car. I love getting in that vehicle, and I love driving. There are some times I would like the car to drive itself, and in that instance, I'd be more than willing to push a button so it drives itself in stop-and-go traffic, for instance. But by and large, I like driving my vehicle. So I'm not sure where it's going to roll out first, because companies are moving in these different directions, as well as with different business models. But I can tell you that it's much easier driving on the freeway than it is in an urban setting.
Yeah, but like regulatory, do you think they'll allow you to take your hands off the wheel on the highway for the city, or will it be useful?
Well, the way that we're moving forward with our regulations is we're not making a determination or a segmentation of the roadway types. In fact, with our regulations, when a company gets a testing permit, they can test in any California street, be it a highway or an urban environment. So right now, we're not having any discussions about a particular type of roadway.
There's a gentleman over here who already has the microphone.
Thank you so much. I believe it was in March there was the first pedestrian fatality with an Uber testing vehicle. Was there a key takeaway from that incident for you?
Well,
I think that, things that happened in Arizona may not be in your purview, but if you have any information about it.
No, it's what I was going to say was that, that happened in Arizona, and it's, we don't know. We don't have the data yet. The NTSB is doing their investigation, so we really don't have any information that we can share.
There's a gentleman over here in the front.
Thank you. Just real quick on the sensor black box thing that goes to the law enforcement. Does that get collected in some kind of database so that patterns can be determined and regulations can result, or is it just stored in separate evidence lockers? And the second question is, the SAE levels seem to be very confusing to the public. What do you think? The public seems not to really understand the difference even between ADAS systems and driverless systems.
Yeah, good point. The first on the data, it's we don't specify how that data is going to be used by law enforcement, and so it's however law enforcement chooses to use that data, presumably be for analytical reasons. On the levels, the SAE levels, you're right. It was an attempt to really define what an autonomous vehicle is. And interestingly enough, our statute had its own definition of autonomous vehicles. We've migrated to the SAE levels, and it's I think it's something that really needs to be flushed out, and SAE is working on the next version. But you're right, because people get an idea about what a vehicle can do simply by what it's called. And that can be dangerous. And so it's, people need to understand not just the capabilities of the vehicle, but what the limitations of the vehicle are. And so having a standard vocabulary will go a long way towards that.
And one of the federal laws being proposed by the House anyway goes towards that end. Who knows if it will ever come about, but it's all about giving notice to the public about these issues. There's a gentleman over here.
Maybe loud enough anyway. A quick comment and a quick question. The quick comment is, did you see the report on Marketplace on National Public Radio yesterday with a professor from Duke University talking about her fear about level 3 testing because of the reaction time of humans? It's a very interesting article if you haven't read it.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah. I didn't see the article, but I assume you're talking about Missy yes. Cummings at Duke. And yeah, the testing of level 3 vehicles is a tricky one, right? That's why we require that test driver to be in that test vehicle and that test driver to be adequately trained. There's that training needs to be specific to the technology that's being developed by the company. And we felt it was very, very important to have that intermediate step.
Yeah, her issue was, as a former fighter pilot, she knew about reaction times. And that's the issue that she was addressing that I think makes us all a little bit scared.
Although we are running out of time, but okay. The DMV is now allowing for driverless testing, which takes right. That part out of it.
Right. But my quick question is, you're with the DMV. I'm in the communications business, fiber optics. We train traffic engineers who build all the smart traffic lights and everything, and they're very concerned about the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So here in California, how's the DMV working with the roads people to try to build an infrastructure to help this work forward?
Right, that's a good question, because I mentioned the infrastructure earlier, right? So we work really, really closely with Caltrans. We're part of the same agency. So we work daily with Caltrans about this technology. And there's a school of thought that the most effective way to ensure safety is rolling out the technology in an autonomous fashion, coupled with vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. So having this infrastructure improvement. The issue is who's going to pay for that infrastructure improvement, right? And so we all recognize that sure, having DSRC in our traffic lights, or having the ability for cars to be able to speak to the infrastructure, receive signals from the infrastructure would be great. But until that time comes, cars are still going to have to make those decisions on their own. That being said, Caltrans has an opportunity right now to, because there's a lot of road improvements that are happening, there's an opportunity to improve specific roads, and while they've got it dug up and before they pour that 30-year concrete, maybe they can put something in there that would help. The age-old question would be, what technology? Because they don't want to they want to put something in there that'll be Betamax, right? They want to put something in there that will actually be used. So, interesting question, and one that is open-ended right now.
Well, Dr. Soriano, thank you very much. It's been very informative today, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having me.